Hello everybody and welcome to my YouTube channel. Oh my gosh, the world is ending. Alright, well, I guess I'll finish this review first before I do anything, because this is important. Hello everybody and welcome to my review of The Twilight Zone 2019 Season 1, Episode 6, 6 Degrees of Freedom. That's a lot of sixes and a lot of ones and 2019s and a lot of numbers going on in here. I'm gonna do a quick little roundup of this episode just because I don't have a lot of time. For those of you who are curious about my life and what I do, I work as a video producer for the YouTube series Microsoft Unboxed, which if you haven't checked out Microsoft's YouTube page, go check it out. It's a fun video series that I do with the wonderful Sonia Dara and Colleen O'Brien. But this week, coming up is Microsoft's Build event, which is like a big event here in Seattle, one of Microsoft's biggest events of the year, and obviously I'm going to be covering that, so most of my life right now is basically devoted to doing that. And that's why I missed getting this review out Thursday and why this one's going to be a little bit shorter for this week, but going forward I'll try and give my reviews the full length of time. So apologies that it's a little bit shorter, but I want it to spark discussion because I'm curious on people's thoughts on this episode. So for this episode, the main concept is we have a mission to Mars, which we've kind of been getting teased throughout the entire season, especially in episode 2 where we got the main character of that episode standing in front of that big mission to Mars sign, which again goes to this theory that this Twilight Zone is all in one shared universe, but I'll get to that at the end of this. Just as the mission to Mars is about to launch, North Korea sends nukes, as we all know that they will eventually one day. Oh god, too real. And basically leads to the destruction of all of humanity. The crew of the ship decides to go to Mars anyways and become the last surviving humans. And we basically get one of the characters talking about basically this idea that all advanced civilizations will eventually destroy themselves, but the question becomes whether or not they will escape their planet before then or not so that they can continue on, and that most advanced civilizations don't actually make that point. This episode is basically exploring that idea and also the psychological effects on the crew as they go to Mars and realize the last of humanity. And there is a twist at the end that I will talk about at the end of this video as well. Besides that last 2-minute twist, this episode is actually a pretty straightforward character drama and character exploration of the specific situation. Now that end twist sort of definitely puts it in the Twilight Zone, but I think the meat of this episode really could have just worked as a one-off episode of anything, like a good character study. I think that's the part that really, really works in this episode. I really loved all the character beats going on, all the stresses, all the stuff that the commander had to go through. Basically said we can't have kids, we can't have relationships, because if we do, then we're all gonna die anyways. And sort of the stress that it put on the crew and them kind of having psychological breaks, and one character basically saying, this is all a dream and this is not real, it's all just a test to, test our mental fortitude on Mars. And there's a great sequence where it kind of all goes to crap right at that moment and he's sort of yelling and screaming. All those psychological bits throughout this episode felt real and felt very, very rooted in these good characters. I mean, we only have an hour with these characters. It felt like I kind of understood each individual character throughout the entire episode. I kind of got a little taste of who they were individually. And I think that goes to some really, really strong writing in this episode, that I could kind of understand each and every single character, where we only got really an hour to learn about each character. To be able to tell me about 6 different characters in an hour and at least give me a kernel of them is really strong. That being said though, there were a few ham-fisted moments, like at the top where the captains basically said, you had to give up your husband to go on this mission, and your husband died to get here. You beat out a ton of applicants, so you're super smart. It felt a little bit like knocking us on the heads like these other characteristics, but again, I understand that that's a little bit of a shorthand, and it worked in this sort of like inspiring speech, but felt a little heavy-handed to try and get us their character ideas. My biggest concern with this episode though is that, again, with the problem with all of the Twilight Zone episodes, it felt a little bit long. This one I kind of am debating though about whether or not that's okay here or not. I think that you need to have that sort of longer episode to really have us sit with these characters and really feel the torture and the psychological breakdown that they're all kind of having throughout the episode. But the biggest problem was a lot of the stuff that they're kind of breaking down over, I've seen before. Like I said, while I do think the writing is good and it all works for me, none of it's really all that surprising. I'm not really like, oh my gosh, that's some new kernel of an idea that I'm really fascinated by. It's like I've seen this kind of stuff before in other movies and TV shows where people are sort of left to be stuck somewhere and they can't get out, and they all think that this is the end times and they kind of have a psychological break. And everything that happens is stuff that I've seen before. None of it's new to me, and that kind of saddened me. So that kind of led it to feeling kind of boring. And I almost wonder if it had been a little bit quicker and got to this point of talking about whether or not we can survive as a species once we destroy ourselves, as that seems to be the main sort of idea that this episode wants to tackle, then if it had been more concise and just focused on that, would have been more interesting. Whereas this, yes, it works very well as a character drama, but doesn't necessarily work for me overall in terms of something new and intriguing and unique. So I think that that's sort of the trade-off here, and I'm unsure how I feel about it, because it's good in and of itself, but it doesn't really surprise me or shock me or do anything like that. Too short to really dive into these characters and make them special and unique, but too long to really make me feel engaged with what I was eventually getting. It's like I would probably watch a whole series of this if they, had a little bit more interesting stuff and drew out these characters a little bit more. I probably would watch this show or this movie. But as it was, it felt a little bit too long or a little bit too short, and you didn't really hit that sweet spot very well for me. Now, what was interesting was the last twist of the episode, which firmly put this in Twilight Zone territory. I mean, like I said, the rest of this episode felt fairly straightforward, but then the twist being is yes, it was a simulation as the guy said, but it was actually a simulation done by aliens, and the aliens were watching us the entire time to see if we could break that problem, whether we would survive after our civilization destroyed itself, and basically the aliens deciding to make first contact. And it kind of dives into this idea, number one, of this whole season of the Twilight Zone kind of being a shared universe, because we've seen aliens being attacking in a previous episode, that maybe that could be tying in, they're trying to force our hand to be you're gonna die, maybe you should try and get to the stars, and sort of giving us a jump start into getting to the stars and, reaching out and becoming better. Maybe the aliens are benevolent in that sense, even when they seem to be malevolent, seem to be evil, they're actually trying to do us good. And also we get little hints throughout this episode that this is all tied together, we get the little spacecraft from the Nightmare at 30,000 Feet. The Whipple Corporation, which is financing this mission, seems to have been through every single episode of The Twilight Zone so far. So I'm curious if the series is going to tie it all together in the end, or if it's really just going to be individual stuff we can kind of piece together our own narrative if we want to. Probably would be fine either way for me if they did tie it all together and had that sort of aliens are malevolent, benevolent idea or something else. I think that would be really cool if you did that as the finale and sort of did something new with The Twilight Zone that's not just one-off stuff. But also if you just make it this sort of meta narrative that we never really get tied together in any explicit way, kind of like the Cloverfield movies, I think that would also be fine as well. I'm just sort of curious what direction they're going to go with it, because right now I could see interesting ways to go either way. But that twist does make this episode a little bit better for me. I was curious because I figured there was going to be a twist, and I thought I was going to dislike it a lot more because it would have felt kind of obvious. But again, I like this twist because it does tie together this idea of, can we actually survive and pull together and work together to make something better even during our darkest hour? And that sort of has that hopeful idea that you don't really see too often in the Twilight Zone. And the ending with the aliens sort of talking about humanity from a distance really kind of brings up Monsters Are Due on Maple Street for me. Except for in Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, they decide to invade, and it's sort of, again, evil aliens. And here it seems to be good aliens. So I like that sort of twist, and I like this sort of idea that it is it definitely has a dark tinge to it because you're torturing these humans essentially and putting them through all this trauma, and the aliens are doing that just as a sort of science experiment. But it also does have this weirdly hopeful vibe to it, because we end hopefully with the crew. The crew makes it to Mars, they survive, they all pull together and realize that they need to become a family together, which I really liked. And then also we get this idea of aliens found that humanity can survive. You're yes, we will get right to the brink of our very destruction, but we will pull together, which is honestly a message I kind of need to hear with stuff like environmental disasters and global warming and all that fun stuff that's going on today in politics and things like that. So I like that sort of upbeat message of this episode that has sort of a dark twang to it, which felt very Twilight Zone, but something new to the Twilight Zone, that it could have this positive ending. And not to say that the original Twilight Zone never had a positive ending. I think there were a few here and there, but I do like it when it kind of breaks that mold, but is able to do it in a uniquely Twilight Zone flavor. So this twist really, really worked for me, and again, I think it will be interesting to see how it ties into the whole season, if at all. So overall, I think this is kind of leaning towards a better episode of the series for me, but still doesn't really break new ground as a whole. I like the ideas, and I think if it had been more concise, it probably would have been better, or if it had been a whole movie, it would have been better. But as it is, this sort of hour-length format kind of still feels like the wrong length for this. I feel like it should be a movie or it should be a shorter episode and really just get at the one idea they want to say. Otherwise, I'm just kind of left like, okay, let's move it along, or at least give it a little bit more depth, but it's sort of hitting this middling ground for me that I'm kind of saddened by. So, good episode, but really just never makes it to great. But what did you all think? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode of The Twilight Zone, so leave your comments below. And if you want more Twilight Zone reviews or discussions of geek and pop culture, or as what through a queer lens and LGBTQ lens, give my channel a subscribe. I swear you will not regret it. It's going to be awesome. And if you want to help make these videos even better, consider giving to my Patreon page. Every dollar helps. It really helps beef up the quality of these videos and helps me pay my bills, which is something that's a little hard to do sometimes. And until next time, live long and prosper.